All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. There might be some more stragglers coming in before long, but that's okay because we have 90 minutes to discuss and work on things. This is primarily a working session, and I know some of you are regular participants with the cluster and are probably aware of that. Other folks might not be so aware of that. Please don't be scared off by it being a working session. The reason we're doing that here at ESIP is because we want to get a variety of opinions, and that includes opinions of people who aren't necessarily familiar with what we've been working on, because what we're trying to develop here is something that's useful to people, whether they've been part of its development or not. And certainly everybody's voice is valued here. Okay, so let me click through some housekeeping stuff. So I know that Laura already put into the chat the session document on there. If you could please sign in by adding your name, affiliation, these sorts of things at the top, we'd appreciate it. That helps us keep track of who is there and so we can give credit and also make sure that if there's any follow-up questions, we can follow up with you. I also want to say thank you to, besides myself and Laura and Tim, who are the cluster co-chairs. We also have Kyla Richards, who was a cluster fellow and is probably going to be a co-chair. We just got to make it official. But for now, she'll be note-taking today officially. And then we also have Jin and Patty from ESIP who are helping us out. So thank you to everybody for that. And finally, I just want to remind you that by participating in the session, you're agreeing to adhere to the ESIP community participation guidelines. I've put a link here. Again, you can find, you should be able to find this through the session document. Hold on, I'm gonna share a link real quick. Okay. Give me one more second. I should have made this. Okay, cool. So I believe, oh no, where'd the chat go? Stay with me for a second. Oh, there it is up there. Okay. So here is the slides for this, what you're seeing right now. And so I just want to, the reason I shared that is because I want to make sure you have clear links to these guidelines and how to report any violations of those guidelines if that's becomes needed. And then lastly, we're going to be referencing these resources at the bottom as we need it as we go through them. But I just want to make sure you know that they're all in one place on the slide, the main things that we're talking about today. Okay, so our agenda today is this presentation right now. This intro is going to take about 5 or 10 minutes, probably closer to 10. And then we're going to have a little Slido survey to get feedback on one of the things we worked on at last year's winter or January meeting, which was the Make Your Data Software Ready section of the guidelines. So we'd like to hear how people are feeling about that, how it's developed. And then from there, we're going to go into about 60 minutes of discussion and development of 3 sections of the primer guidelines. One section on the ecological metadata language metadata standard, one section on the ISO 19115 metadata standard, and another section on the MIXS metadata standard. Again, don't be scared if you don't know anything about those things. At the very least, you can stay around and learn, and probably some of the questions you have, if you don't know anything about those standards, your questions will help us understand what's important to emphasize. And then we'll wrap that up with about 10 minutes of discussion. If there's anything, any feedback people have of ways we could make this effort more useful or productive, as well as trying to capture some takeaways. And so that's the next sort of important thing is I want to remind people we do try to summarize the session for the ESIP report out, which happens, I forget when exactly, it's a couple weeks after this, where we get a chance to summarize what we did in our session. So if there's any points that you think are especially salient, please don't be afraid to speak up. Okay, so now I'm going to take a little bit to give some background on the biological data standards cluster for those who may not have been involved before. There's a link here to our wiki page, which it's pretty lo-fi, but it tells you what you need to know. And essentially this cluster was started a few years ago. Actually, I'm not sure officially when, but by Abby Benson and some others, I think Aaron Satterthwaite and Robert McGuinn. And the idea was that they recognized, that biological data had a lot of a lot of overlap and integration. It cross paths a lot with earth science, and yet they're really heterogeneous and can be uniquely organized, in individual projects. That there's standards out there, but as in general, biologists are not well educated in these standards. They're not necessarily using them consistently, and it can be really confusing for both biologists who are new to managing data and data managers who are new to biology. And then it can also be confusing for data users downstream to navigate those inconsistencies. So this cluster was started with the thought that the biological data community in the US could benefit from guidance and best practice documentation, training, and community building. And I want to make it clear that we don't think we're the first group to do this or the only group to be doing this, but we recognize that we had an opportunity in ESIP to work, to do this for a specific sort of community in the world. I would also like to say that one of the things we try to keep in mind when we do this is to make our efforts sustainable and transparent, and that's something that's also not necessarily true for all those for various groups. So when the cluster was first started, one of the things they talked about was what do they want to talk about, and they generated these themes, which I sort of just summarized about increasing awareness and interest in standards, making sure that there's a shared vision for the group, and then providing opportunities to share that knowledge and coordinate knowledge. And then also too, we do try to work with other clusters, notably, for example, the marine data cluster and the semantics cluster. There's a few others that I'm blanking on right now, but we're interested in connecting across ESIP. We're not trying to be biologists or biological data managers on our own. After thinking about those community-generated themes, the group settled on the decision to make a primer. Originally, they were thinking, well, we should have some sort of decision tree that helps people choose standards and practices for biological data, and that actually ended up developing into this biological data standards primer, which I see Laura just put into the chat, that link. After that was published, people said, well, this is great. It sort of gives you this list of things that are useful, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how to use them. And so now we're working on extending that primer via what we're calling guidelines. I will note too that at first we were calling them best practices, but recently, after rather long discussion, we decided to use the guidelines instead to just sort of describe them as additional explanatory material. And so if you see those different names, I just want to be clear that it's the same thing as best practices and guidelines, although we're trying to use guidelines. So the goal of these documents together is to help people choose which standards to use and also to educate people. To try to get also help use them to promote buy-in on these standards from data managers and agencies and who are trying to learn these basics. And like I sort of said before, the audience we see for both the primer and these guidelines is either a biologist who might be new to data management or a data manager who might be new to biological data. So I guess I'm going out of order a little bit here, but so what products have we made? I already mentioned the primer. This is what it looks like. We've talked about redesigning it or not. I really like the design. Actually, I think it sticks in your brain and is easy to read. But you may have seen this before promoted in other places. There's a QR code here and the DOI that will bring you straight to that. You can feel free to share that with anyone. Again, this is the sort of high level, these are things that you should probably know about if you're going to be working with biological data. But in progress, like I said, we've developed these guidelines, which are currently being developed with a Quarto, using a Quarto book format, and are shared in a GitHub repository. So that structure of working in GitHub is really important to us for a couple of reasons. One is it's important that it be transparent and open. Two is that we hope that the product is something that can be forked and then further developed or detailed out by different organizations. And three, we're trying to capture the development and then through the various feedback mechanisms of GitHub, allow it to evolve over time and in a way that doesn't take years for every update. So if you have any issues with this that you think of after our discussion today, or it's because it's something we didn't discuss today, some aspect of it, please feel free to pull issues. I mean, that's what it's there for. And especially, we try to work asynchronously, since we only meet once a month. And then the lower link here is just the rendered version of that. where you can actually look at it as a as HTML web page. So the primer has 5 sections, which are listed here, and we're extending these sections into guidelines one at a time. The first one that we did was number 5, make your data software ready. And so in a little bit, Tim's going to walk you through some opportunity to give feedback to that, to be able to review and give feedback. And now we're working on number 1 is provide context and understandability to your data. And so this is the section that we'll be working on today by examining those 3 standards. What does each section of the guidelines look like? This is just a screenshot of that HTML. And really what I wanted to point out is over here on the right-hand side. Can you all see my pointer okay?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you. Each section, so in this case, use non-proprietary formats as a section, should have 3 subsections. Why? Basically some explanation as to like, why is this important to know? Why should you be using these things? The next section, key information, is maybe a little bit ambiguous, and so we're interested in learning how to make this structure more precise if possible. But key information is sort of like, what are some of the main things that you would tell somebody about this standard if you were going to start working with them? So this could be, for example, maybe a grad student who you're bringing to the field for the first time, or a data manager who you've just thrown a data set into their lap and they're not sure what to make of it. So we're trying to find a balance between a deep dive where we go down all the rabbit holes and a superficial, here's a couple links, good luck. And then finally, top references is supposed to be a list of references. These can be anything from links to DOIs or some other type of citation, where what we're trying to do is give people a list so that they can do a deep dive in those rabbit holes when they have time, and they can come back and work through them little by little. And again, we don't expect this information to be static. We expect it to evolve over time. So don't take this to mean that this is the best it'll ever be, and that's all it can ever be. Certainly, if you have suggestions for ways it can be improved on any section, they're very welcome. Okay, so with all that, I guess I'll pause for a minute, Tim, before we get into the feedback, and see if anybody has any questions. I know I whipped through that rather quick, and like I said, not everybody here has been maybe part of the cluster before. Are there any questions about anything I've said? Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to stop sharing, and Tim, I will hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to share with you 2 links. The first will be to the webpage that we're actually hoping to get some feedback on. And the second link here will point you to the questions that we're asking. They'll cover 3 different topics, mainly on clarity of the webpage, on its aesthetics, and on the utility. So any feedback is much appreciated. We're using Slido for this. So with Slido, you can provide your answers to the question anonymously. I'll share my screen here in a little bit. And the answers that you provide will pop up on the screen, as said, anonymously, and we might be asking for some feedback or some, clarification if you do want to chime in or speak up. And then the only thing being with Slido is, as I'm going through the questions, you won't be able to advance through the questions yourself. I'll just have to do that on my end. So with that being said, if you guys have any questions on Slido or on how to provide your answers, let me know. Otherwise, hopefully you guys can see my screen here. And with that second link that I've provided, hopefully you can see the question that's been asked on whether or not you feel like the information on the web page is clearly presented and understandable. And if not, what are some of the things that that could be improved?
Tim, I'm realizing since we have probably some people who are not that familiar with this, why don't we give maybe about 3 or 4 minutes for people to peruse the information, and then another couple minutes to answer this
That
first
works.
question.
I
And then
think that's
maybe
a great idea.
we can take about 2 minutes for each Slido question.
Perfect.
All right,
I'll
y'all.
just keep-
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Tim. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I'll keep this question up here, in case people do feel like they already want to chime in. But yes, feel free to have a look over the webpage and answer this question kind of within the next maybe 5 minutes or so.
Perfect.
Just
And
keep
you
going.
know, if you all have any questions, something that's confusing, or you're not quite sure what we're asking for, please don't hesitate to speak up or ask a question in the chat. What we're hoping is to get some useful feedback here, not to have you be worried about you know, the task itself.
There will be, I think, 3 open-ended questions and 2 questions on a scale of 1 to 5. So just to give a bit of sense of what we're looking for.
Matt, I see you have your hand up. You can go ahead and ask your question or give your feedback.
Yeah, I think that first comment that showed up, the primer guide, could be more clearly linked to the primer itself. I was curious about linking the 2 resources together. I know if I perused and got to like the introduction of the page, the primer guide page, and found the link back to the primer itself, but then on the primer, there's nothing that goes the other way. So some reciprocal linking would be really helpful. I don't know if you all had a plan for that or not.
I don't know if we did.
No,
Steve and Laura, I
we
don't
didn't
know.
have a plan.
Hmm.
But I would say that, I mean, this is exactly the type of stuff that we're looking for. You know, we're so close to the project that it's really hard to catch details like that. So thanks for pointing that kind of thing out. Believe me, there's nothing that y'all could suggest that's going to be too obvious, because
Mhm.
we're very, very close to it.
Yeah. And a link to the Go Fair website, I think that's a great idea as well. You should definitely include that. Keep this question open for 1 more minute before we move on to the next. Hmm. This is great stuff, guys. I think rather than moving on to the next question, I think it's good to maybe go over some of these answers, because I think there's some really good little bits of little nuggets of information and really helpful suggestions there that I want to make sure that we capture. Related to whether or not it might be helpful to have a what or definition, I think that's great. I think we typically try to capture that information mainly in the key information, if I'm not mistaken.
We did, but it's
perhaps.
a little bit of a catch-all, so
Mhm.
I could see trying to break it out to some succinct what, and I think this came up with the metadata standards that we're going to be discussing after this. So this again, this is good to hear.
Yeah. Some of what is under the key information could actually be in a glossary. Fair point. Tidy and long/wide spreadsheets are different concepts. You need to more clearly differentiate them. Honestly, if the suggestion is there, then I think we should. I think that's probably a good concept to at least clarify.
And to me, that's exactly the kind of thing that would do well pulled as a GitHub issue, so that we could discuss it a little bit more and make references to how we came to that understanding. I think with that particular idea, we're trying to get the idea across that that tabular data can be in these two main formats that are popular in biology and ecology, but perhaps maybe a more careful understanding is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And add examples of some licenses. So I think that's something that we might be able to link to, like the most commonly used licenses. Perhaps science. Adding a link to the FAIR principles. I think hyperlinking that would be useful. And then the table of contents on the right could be nested within the primary table of contents on the guide for the left. I agree. I think that's something that we've brought up as well. Just something to make it look a little bit more spiffy, if you will.
All right, Tim, I think we're ready to move on to the next question, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, so the second question is on aesthetics. Do you find the current aesthetic of the web page, the rendered web page, visually appealing or not? The word
Tim,
repulsive might be a little bit.
I was just gonna say, I just caught the way
you.
you asked that. There's only two choices, y'all. You hate it or you love it.
Yeah, it's black and white. There's no gray.
So I will say, don't be afraid to rag on this a little bit. I have worked with a designer in my office, and she had a few pointers, which I haven't made into suggestions yet. So I appreciate all the smiley faces, but don't be afraid to tell us you really don't like looking at it.
The next question will kind of dive into some of the things that could be improved aesthetically speaking. So you will be able to kind of provide a little bit more detail on why it's a 3 or a 4 out of 5, if you want. I'll give this just a couple of more seconds here before we move on to the next one. It's like majority is like 3 out of 5, which, if this were a restaurant, I wouldn't necessarily want to go there straight away, but I wouldn't rule it out either. So we can work with 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5. We can work with that for sure. Okay. I hope everybody's been able to fill out this poll. I'm going to just move on to the next one. So again, related to the aesthetics, is there anything that you would like to see changed aesthetically? So for example, having that table of contents on the right-hand side, kind of nested in the table of content on the left. Something like that would be is something that we'll definitely take into account. If there's anything else, please feel free to chime in. add color. I like that one. Chain resources first references. Excellent.
There's one that I'd actually be interested to hear if there's any feedback on. Last year we talked about the importance of having the links completely exposed as URLs instead of, masking them with some sort of text. For me, I cringe when I look at those URLs. I wish we could cover them up, but people said, I'm hesitant to click on something where if I don't know where it's going type of thing. Does anybody have opinions on that?
Matt?
I just went through that same question and I'm trying to find, I found something on Wikipedia that talked about links. And I think our conclusion was to make the text descriptive that hyperlinks to the web page, because sometimes the web page URLs don't mean anything and they're very, they mask a lot. They just don't make any sense. I'm gonna try to find that issue where we had that conversation and I'll link it in the chat.
Thanks. Kate?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if this is still true or not, but I think that that if you just include the URL as it is, right? Which, Matt, I think what you're saying is sometimes it's opaque, so you can't really tell, like, what it's referring to. But that's difficult for, I guess, accessibility purposes and I guess for screen readers and things like that to be able to parse that. But I'm not sure if that's true anymore. I don't know if they've evolved so that they can actually, so that a screen reader or something could read the URL that is embedded within the descriptive text. And maybe that's something to check.
Cool, thank you both. I just tried to capture that in a response.
Fritz, you want to chime in?
Yeah, not to belabor the URL discussion, but Steve, I see your point there about not knowing where you're going, but I feel like it's a trade-off, and to have some description within the link or a title to the page that the link is directing to is a better option there. Plus, you can have a URL spelled out on a page, but it could still redirect somewhere else because you assign that hyperlink on the back end.
That's a really good point.
And I think that's what we landed on last time as well, is that we have at least a little bit of a description for users to understand what the URL will reference, at least the type of material. So
I think another-
people, sorry, go ahead, Kate.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I just remembered, like, the other approach was to say, put like unlinked text that says, World Register of Marine Species, and then follow that in parentheses with the URL, which kind of gets long, but that's kind of a workaround as well.
Excellent points. Okay. Just in the sake of time, just going to move on to question 3A on the utility. So this rendered web page in its current format, would you consider this resource to be useful, either as Steve pointed out, for data managers to further understand like the biological side of things, or for biologists to kind of understand or help start better understanding, like making your data software ready from a data management perspective? And just so you guys know, following this question will again be a question to kind of elaborate perhaps on your choice. Few more seconds here. It seems majority is score is about a 4 out of 5. Perfect. Hope everybody's been able to fill this out as we'll go to the next final question. So again, on the utility, so how can we make this resource more findable? How can we ensure it reaches the right people? I've heard of schema.org. I'm not too familiar with it. What would adding schema.org do for the findability? Would that make it more or better indexable by the Google search engine? Is that right? Or am I completely off here?
Yeah, and this is a little tongue in cheek because I've been hearing a lot about schema.org this whole week. But it's metadata that Google indexes. I know it's for data sets. I don't know if you can do it for other resources like something like this. But for example, I do a Google search for the title of this document and it does not show up. So figuring out how to get it into the Google search, and I think that might be one way to do it.
Steve, I don't know if you wanted to say something about the steps we're going through to try to publish this and how USGS review process is involved in that.
Yeah, I will. Thank you. So yeah, that's a little bit, or rather, Matt, I wouldn't say it's by design that you can't find it, but we've definitely been a little bit hesitant to promote it too much, in the sense of having random people find it. Yeah, so no DOI yet. What's published right now, we sort of see is that we're trying to maintain it as this draft version, in part because for it to become an official document in the same way that the primer was something that Abby and the other co-chairs published and got a DOI for that to happen, I as one of the leaders on it have to have USGS review it, which can take a while. So rather than have that inhibit our progress, we decided to sort of keep having it online as a sort of working document, and then perhaps publishing pieces of it or not. Again, we don't have a solid plan yet. Kind of depends on which day of the week it is for me in terms of what I think is best to do. But this information we're collecting right now is definitely really valuable because we certainly haven't talked about anything like search engine optimization or schema.org. So I think we don't have a lot of knowledge in this area.
Thanks. I knew that the DOI thing would come up, and there's a reason that it does not have a DOI at this moment.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Those are just in the nick of time.
That was just me. I just wanted to write that one down. Yeah.
Okay, good. Just for the sake of time, realize we're already halfway through, so I'll stop sharing. Thank you so much all for providing some feedback. It's much appreciated, and we'll tackle these and see if we can add any issues to our GitHub page and further this discussion.
Okay,
Back to you,
so
Steve.
Back to me. Here we go. Right, 1 second. All right, so hopefully you all now are looking at a slide that says breakout/development. 60 minutes. What are we doing today? Is that, can I get a yes or a thumbs up?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, and some animated emojis from Matt. Great. Yeah, so we weren't sure how many people we would have today. We were ready to break it out into 3 breakout rooms if we had a lot of people, but I think being that we just have a dozen or so, we'll all stay in one group. And the idea is that we'll work through these draft documents, one for EML, one for ISO 19115, and one for MixS. We'll work through them one at a time, giving each one about 20 minutes. I think are we still on the right schedule for that, or do we use up too much time?
No, I think that used up too much time. I think 15 minutes.
Okay,
perhaps
we'll do
slightly less.
Okay, we'll aim for 15 minutes, and then if that, shortens the discussion at the end, I think that's okay. But so what you can do is go ahead and either in these slides, click on the metadata standards EML. Perhaps somebody could throw it in the chat.
I did it.
And okay, great, thank you. Okay, gotta find my little chat box. There we go. Thanks. And so now, are you seeing the Google Doc on my screen share again?
Yep.
Okay, great. So what you're seeing here is a draft version of what would eventually end up in that Quarto sort of book down looking format that we just reviewed. Where again you'll see the structure that we described. In this case, we did add a section called "What is it?" And then underneath that, why, key information, and then we had called it top 5 references. The 5 isn't really important. We're still struggling a little bit, or discussing rather what's the best way to pinpoint that. And then at the bottom is anything missing. This is sort of like if you're thinking of something that doesn't really fit into any of these sections, but let me zoom in. Something that doesn't really fit into any of these sections, but you think is important to include, then you can toss it down there. And so we'll take about 15 minutes to work through this. You can read what's already in here based on some brainstorming and draft work we did at a previous cluster meeting. And you can improve it or just comment on it, and feel free to open any of them up for discussion while we take 15 minutes to do it. Again, the point of this is that it's a working session, so we're just all here in the room together to collaborate on this document. You don't need to be asked to give input.
Yes, Pam, we can put the links in the chat.
So I have a question. I know somebody in our review we just did talked about separating resources and references. So just to make sure I understand it correctly, is the idea here that, for example, in here we have key information and there's several packages that are related to writing EML, that would be broken out into its own section? Is that what the thought was?
I think so. I was looking at a lot of the R packages, which were resources on how to do, coordinate or taxonomy information, which is different than references to learn additional information.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
That
Thanks,
was the
Eric.
thought behind that comment.
Okay. I'm curious am I still on? Am I unmuted? I can't tell anymore. I don't know where my box is.
You're unmuted.
You're unmuted.
Okay,
Yep.
good. All right, excellent. I'm curious how people feel about the what is it? Like I said, that's sort of something we didn't do in the other sections. I feel like this is a little bit of a technical definition. Is it friendly enough? Is it approachable enough for folks that maybe don't use EML regularly? Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, And this is related to one of the references I added in there is you dive in and say this is an XML schema. Well, what is XML?
Right.
You know, and I think that's where you're getting at when it's kind of a little technical in here. I don't know what the right level is for
Mhm.
who might show up in this document.
Well, I do think, like I said, that the people who would be in here, they might have that technical background. And so for some of them, you know, say you're a data manager who's just new with biology, that might not be that intimidating. But I think like I can imagine back in like first year of grad school, if somebody had thrown this in my lap. In fact, no, I can remember looking at EML and being like, I don't get it. And so I just sort of walked away. So that was, you know, several years ago. Luckily, since then I've had time to learn. But it was overwhelming. So I think it's a fair point.
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether some of the information below needed to be there. Like EML is a metadata standard used to describe or ecological data, including biology. It's based in XML.
Yeah, you're saying that's already in another place, Sarah, or?
I think you've put some of it in the
Oh,
Y,
there, right.
but
Yeah,
in what is it? It's a metadata standard used to describe ecological resources.
I like what
I
you're
think
saying.
that's the core piece of what is, and then you can get into the details.
Yeah, definitely.
Is a metadata schema.
I guess if I were to come in from the outside, and I apologize, I had a conflict, so I missed much of this session. I would wonder, are the categories in here relevant to my particular area of research? And how many different areas of research within biology can fit neatly into the schema that somebody else designed that I wasn't a part of. Coming in from the outside, that would be my initial skepticism.
Sure. Well, Pam, is there another standard that you normally subscribe to?
No.
Yeah. So that's, I would say, more typical in my experience with biologists is they usually don't have a standard that they say, this is what I normally do, but then, here's why it doesn't work. It's more that they look at a standard and they do see how their work doesn't fit into it well, but it's hard to show a counterpoint of what would work well. So what sorts of things, what sorts of information would you be looking for to sort of, feel comfortable about like that it does work for your work, like specific mentions of that type of work or type of data, or what types of stuff?
Before I answer that, I'm going to throw another constructive, I hope, question, which would be, why would I benefit from fitting the types of data that I use into a broader scheme beyond the usual people that I already collaborate with, and we already have a system worked out that works for us? That's playing a bit devil's advocate. I kind of also would have some answers to that, but I'm curious to hear what this group would say.
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab at it. I mean, so let's see, I'll try to give the short version is since it sounds like you have, some sense of it already. It's, I would go to talk about typical reasons for championing open science and fair data. Also how your data is probably undervalued or undervalued, underpotentialized. The point is your data probably has more potential than just the people that you're sharing it directly with who are privy to that, less widely used schema. So by sharing your information more widely, it becomes more broadly available to science, and therefore all the different ways that science is used to move our knowledge forward as humans. That's sort of the high level thing. On the low level side, I would say, or on the nitty gritty side, I would say, if you are not already using some sort of open standard where other people can clearly understand the definitions and unequivocally reference identifiers for those definitions, then there's a good chance that your data will be difficult to be interpreted later on, when you're gone, or when somebody is going to use it without knowing that you're the person to ask. And so, and I think most biologists have been in that situation where somebody hands you their data and you're just like, I don't what does this mean, you know? And that's, I think, the reason to use any standard. It doesn't have to be EML, but just to have a clear documented definition of what you mean by the data you've recorded.
And then the last question I have, thank you for those. Those are
Yeah.
very compelling answers. The final question I would ask is, so this is a standards effort in the open source space. I know that there are companies like Esri who are also looking to be sort of central compilers and standardizers of data sets as well. Well, you don't know this, but I kind of have a preference for the open source universe, but there's a lot of people who are very strong advocates of the, private sector products as well. How do you envision this approach positioning itself in the market relative to offerings by the private sector?
I want to think about that one for a second. Anybody else want to take a stab?
Well, I had some other things I wanted to add to the first answer, if I can. I would say also, if you are a scientist trying to do science, your work should be reproducible. And if it is not, how can people trust the output of your research if they can't examine your data and just figure out what you are working with as the baseline for your analyses? And also funding purposes. Some funding sources require you to share your data when you are done with your project. Yeah.
Yeah,
Could
those
you
are good.
repeat your other question about industry, Pam?
Yes, I was saying that there are some major geospatial private sector actors, Esri being one, Google being another. Honestly, Microsoft has a stake in this space as well, and they are all sort of vying with one another to be environmental data repositories. And I imagine there are some sort of approaches to standardization of categories and metadata within that. So I was just wondering, so this is sort of an open source analog, I would say. I just wonder, is there any dialogue back and forth between private sector partners' approaches to standardizing metadata and what's going on in this open source space? I don't know that there needs to be necessarily.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
I don't think I could cite anything specifically in terms of like, this group, for example, isn't talking directly with Esri. And we'd love to have, if there was Esri people who could come in and give us advice. I think that'd be great, because our goal here is to help biologists just be more functional with their data. It's not about, I am also, a lover and champion of open science, but it's not about winning or something. It's just, let's make it easier to do our job. But I would say, I guess, a couple of compelling reasons to at least have open standards in your toolkit is because many government agencies require them. So like Laura was saying, if that's where your funding is coming from, that's one reason you might have to use them. Or if you're trying to reuse government data, which happens all the time, all the data that these big projects that are excuse me, that was 10 minutes, Tim, just so you know. I put a little timer on, so maybe just a couple of minutes more. But what was I saying? Right. So when you're trying to reuse open data, it's going to be documented with an open standard. And one of the reasons that open standards are there is because of groups like Esri or Microsoft, Google, even ISO. To be honest, it's expensive to buy those standards and to keep up with those standards. And so most scientists don't have the luxury of having too much money. And I think that, so if you can use an open source tool, like a standard that's open source, you'll at least always have a tool that's working, even if it's not maybe the tool that 100% of the industry is using. And then likewise, I would also say that companies like Esri, because of the fact that they're using these open data, like government data and things like that, they need to be aware of these standards too, and be able to crosswalk in and out of them. So they're sort of being subject to the same ideas as to why they should pay attention to these standards.
I want to be clear, I'm totally support. I think this is great. I just kind of want to get a better sense of.
No, it's good. Hey,
some of the
if I can't answer those, then I'm in trouble. That's part of my job. So, cool. So I think we're coming up on 15 minutes here. It's yeah, and right, and Laura made a point in the chat that we do discuss this a little bit in another section. But these are really good points, because it is about that buy-in. If this document's not going to be useful to people if they look at it and say, I don't want to deal with it, So it looks like we got some comments in here and some suggestions and things like this. I appreciate that. And what we'll do is revisit this, and our next cluster meeting is on February 1st, right? That's what we said, Laura?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so we'll revisit these a little bit then. So now we're going to take another 15 minutes and move to ISO 19115, which is, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, this is a standard that evolved out of the FGDC standards in, gosh, when was that? The 90s or the early 2000s? Sarah O'Connor, help me out here. It's
90s.
90s, thank you. But in any case, this was a standard that was developed on purpose, recognizing that we needed a really good standard for spatial information, especially for geospatial information. There is a biological extension to it that's not super widely used, but importantly, there's major government agencies like the one I work for, USGS, as well as NOAA and NASA, that do require metadata in ISO 19115. So for that sense, it's an important one to at least be aware of. EML, the last one we looked at, and ISO don't place they aren't totally dissonant, but there are some differences in the way that they're structured that make it difficult to go back and forth between the two. But it's not impossible. It just requires a little knowledge of both. Okay, I'm gonna set my timer again for 10 minutes. Sarah, I actually have a question for you. Oh wait, Matt, go ahead. You raised your hand.
I don't want to derail. So what I hear myself thinking about how would somebody use this information? And what scares me is this is a lot of really detailed information. And when it comes down to it, if somebody's working with NCEI and NCEI needs to generate ISO 19115-2 metadata, they're going to give them a Google document or, a web form to fill out or something. There's not going to be digging into the standard and knowing the standard. And so I guess I'm hesitant to say this, but I'm just curious about like, where's the user who's going to use this information? What are they going to do with that information? Because I mean, it's good to have the background of what these standards are, but at the end of the day, is like, I guess my thought was this was more geared towards a data manager, and I wouldn't expect a data manager to be writing ISO XML or EML XML or any of those things. I would expect them to use some form or work with the data center that already has those features. So if this is more of just like background as to what the metadata standards are, I don't, so
Yeah,
I'm gonna
I know
stop.
where you're going with that, Matt. It's if this is a guide to get someone started, should it be basic concepts of data documentation, description, keywords, methods, quality control, distribution? Standards are recommended, and there are many web-based tools, and then linked to NCA, the EML, and then linked to a few different tools or standards.
Yeah, I can say I also agree with you, Matt and Sarah, as someone who is at NCEI and is also, from a biology background. I think the most important thing for most people to understand about this is that it's something that government agencies use, because it doesn't really seem like it's very common outside of that world. Yeah, I guess my question for the feedback that Steve, I think you just typed in from Sarah's comment, that is more generic than ISO. I feel like that would be almost an editing of the primer to change talking about metadata away from talking about specific standards into talking about basic concepts of metadata. So I don't know how people feel about that. Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea?
And that's partially why I didn't want to say anything, because I don't want to throw a wrench in everything that's going on.
But it is a really good point. Again, I'm probably too close to it here because I do actually work with these metadata like EML and ISO. I work with, probably a couple times a week. As do a couple other people on this call, I'm sure. And it's not that I could write it in my sleep, but I guess so it's a little bit hard for me to take a step back and remember that, though I think what you're saying is important. It's a good point, because again, if somebody takes a look at this and says, this is not a good place for me to start, then that's not what we're trying to accomplish.
So is there any like global platforms or tools that people use, data managers use, biologists use to record their metadata in ISO format? I typically only work with ISO when I'm creating like records for the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System, and I use EML when I'm mobilizing stuff to OBIS. So I feel like for me there's really specific use cases where I would use it, but it and that's when I would use those tools. But I don't know if that's people in Europe might not want to use that tool if they're obviously not interested in putting their record up in the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System. So is there any global toolkits that people can use if they're interested in recording their metadata?
I can't think of one of a standalone tool. The tools that I always know or that I know of most are the ones that are sort of integrated into like submission systems, like NCI's sent to NCEI.
Yeah.
And at USGS, we're working on, I unfortunately don't have the time to keep up with the metadata group there, but, or not with any regularity, but they're working on making it easier for people to generate ISO, because for a long time, what people used there was CSTGM. So they have the tools for that as sort of standalone, generators, but now they're being, forced to use ISO.
Yeah, Comet is,
go ahead.
I was just going to answer Matt in the chat about Comet. I think at this point in time, it's only available to NOAA users, but I think they're planning to expand it to login.gov. I don't think it's been deployed yet.
Yeah, that's what I remember too. That is like a low priority, but it is on the list.
Yeah, I think they've got it on like the dev tier, but it hasn't been deployed to production.
Well, that's a good call, Kate. Import. That's right. Import. But doesn't import also allow you to just sort of generate like unstructured metadata? Or am I?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I really know that much about it, but I know that people use it.
Okay.
I know that a lot of people who submit data to NCEI use imports. So there has to be some sort of either you can generate ISO or not ISO, but there's some way that it could be transformed then easily into ISO.
Yeah, import is structured XML that's standards agnostic, but it can transform into ISO.
There you go. Is it publicly accessible to you? I remember it was like a little bit more, it's more open. You might have to sign up.
They have allowed non-NOAA users in, but I don't think it's widely open outside of NOAA. It's primarily NIMS and NOS.
Yeah.
That's Fisheries and National Ocean Service within NOAA.
But I do think going back to what Matt said initially, like that's a good point, is if people can't sort of play around with ISO, then like they don't really have a reason to learn it. I mean, I've learned it in the course of like my jobs where I've managed data. But yeah, as a biologist, I never had access to a tool. Like you said, Matt, it was like, oh, here's a Google Doc, here's a Word doc, whatever it is to capture that metadata. And so maybe that is something this section could provide is these various editors that might be available to at least some groups of people. Well, we have just a couple minutes left. One thing I'm curious about, let's see here. I don't think we have the NCEI workbooks on here, do we? Oh, yes, we do down
We
here.
do.
Okay.
I had a question
Excellent.
about this biological extension. And Sarah O'Connor, if I can ask you, or if anyone else knows about this biological extension to ISO, I guess, is anyone using that?
I mean, my honest answer is I don't know. I also question whether or not it's an official extension of ISO. At the back of the original ISO standard that was released in 2003, they did sort of an example of how the standard could be extended, and they used the biological FTDC standard as an example. So that's where that document that you've linked to is coming from. Just sort of an example at the back of the document as to how a standard could be extended. I've never seen it published as its sort of standalone independent standard. I don't know anyone that's using it.
Yeah, I've seen examples of it. Sorry, that was our time. I've seen examples of it. I forget who took the time to, generate them, but then I've always been told too that like, you can generate all that metadata, but most likely search engines aren't going to harvest it or index it just because it's not built into their design.
Yeah, that's been my experience.
Yeah.
I know within NOAA we generated sort of a draft XML schema for that based off of the example at the back of the book, but no catalog that I am aware of supports it.
Yeah.
Maybe we shouldn't have that link. Also, when I went to that link, it said that the publisher and contact info were NCDDC.
Yeah, so that,
Dennis, right? Yeah, okay.
yeah, that was
Yeah.
released prior to the NCI merger.
Cool. Laura, would you mind adding some comments or, whatever, somehow
Yeah.
annotating what you just said?
Do
Thank
that.
you.
Yeah, we can move on.
All right, y'all, get into Mixes. Here we go. Last one, and let's see, let's just take 10 minutes, well, 13 minutes. So we have our 10 minutes at the end for discussion and to wrap things up. Okay, so here we have Mixes, which is for people who are not working with molecular data. It's a standard that works well it's probably most famously for DNA sequences. So things like eDNA might be a data type that you've heard of. And it's somewhat implemented in this third bullet point here. You can see the INSDC, which, Lord help me, for the International Nucleotide, I can't remember the rest of it, but the INSDC includes the DDBJ, which is a database from Japan for DNA sequences. I think it's the DNA database from Japan. EMBL EBI, which is in Europe, and then NCBI, which is in the United States. And so those are all really important and very large databases that are kind of using these standards or the Mixes standard and working to implement it more all the time. But sort of this is one of those standards that is still very much in development. That doesn't mean that it's not usable. It's very usable, but it's the community is still working hard to improve it. And I recently, actually, just as an aside, I recently got involved with the GSC and their regular meetings. So if anybody's interested in getting involved in those conversations, let me know. I'd be happy to get you links and stuff.
Not really sure if I'd include the way it's pronounced as key information, perhaps, but
That's true.
fair.
You know something, as I was introducing that, it occurred to me that maybe a section that we could include to give some context to this and the ISO example is sort of, you know, who should be using it. So, you know, we've talked about having, at this point, we have what, why, sort of how, but we don't have a who. And so I'm a little wary of that because people might just use that as a filter to say, you know, like this isn't for me, but I see a few thumbs up there. So we could give it a shot, what it's like to add that description.
Do you mean to this specific standard or to all three specific standards?
To all three.
Yeah.
You know, something I'm thinking too that like I said, I just got involved with the GSC. They're a really nice group of people, of course. Although I had not met any of them before this meeting. Some of them had been working a little bit with GBIF, you know, on some of the DNA derived extension of Darwin Core. But it might be good to maybe have one of them come and talk to us about this particular one and see how they introduce it. Because I think like that would be good to hear, to find that like the sort of clashing points of somebody who is an expert in this and uses it all the time, and the majority of our group who does not use this regularly.
I like that idea. I'm also really echoing Matt's comment here on what does it, like the checklists and packages, what does it mean? Because to me, it makes it sound like Mixes is a validator tool rather than a metadata standard. So I'm a little confused by indeed what, you know, what does it mean, a set of checklists and packages?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good call, and that's definitely worth explaining. They use that terminology. I don't know who started it, but a checklist being sort of a checklist of terms, like have you recorded these metadata, and then a package being, I think, a group of checklists. And then now what's interesting, and I'll put this here, they've embraced LinkML as their structural, not quite sure the right word for it, language schema. But that's something that's also new to me as well. And something that can be confusing. And I know, and they know that it's confusing. For example, what is oh gosh, there was some term, you know, that they use for a specific type of information in a term definition. And I had never heard that term before and they said they strictly use it because of LinkML, not because it's something they came up with on their own.
If I could chime in again for a sec, I finally was able to get the Google Docs open and kind of view what was in them. I had some connection trouble. And what I would be looking for is I would be looking for like clear definition, easy to find clear definitions of what each metadata header means and how I'm allowed to fill out those columns. And I didn't see those things quickly scanning through. I'm sure they exist somewhere, but I would suggest maybe making that kind of information faster to find. So if someone wants to start using one of these standards, they can pretty quickly know, okay, well, what do I need to provide and how am I, you know, what are my options for how I answer what each of these columns asks for.
That's actually, Pam, it's a really good point and something that I've heard discussed with both like the Darwin Core world and the Mixes world, where a lot of times the people who are developing the standard are so sort of like used to this world of thinking about standards and computer like machine understanding of these structures, that they forget that many biologists find it most comfortable to see it in some type of tabular format. And I think that's a really important point to like that you made, that you should be able to go from this information to something that feels comfortable to look at that you can run with.
And then I know what I need to provide. Like I've skimmed all of these and I think the concepts are really cool, but I don't actually know like what do I pull from my data that I can then put into one of these structures. That's what I want to get to really quickly. And so that would help, I think, the community to help them get to that answer faster.
Yeah. So that goes back to, oh, go ahead, Tim, sorry.
No, I was just wondering, like, in my head, I'm thinking of this tool online where you would just select what kind of data you've collected or what kind of repository you're hoping to use, and then based off of that answer, they would, recommend a certain standard and the fields that you would have to populate. Is there like a tool like that online? You know,
For
that
mixes
kind of
specifically, or
bounces, yeah, that bounces between different standards and the required fields that would need to be populated to make sense of your data. Because I think that there are specific tools, if you want to, I thought Matt included a comment in the email document, whether or not there's tools that help you, produce an email XML file. I think there is. But I'm wondering if there's like easy tools that help you kind of bounce between the different standards and what fields are required within each.
Yeah, even just like a lookup table or a man page or something. Like, don't make me go through drop down menus because I'll want to pull my hair out. But
Yeah.
something where I can just look quickly and be like, okay, this is what's asked. These are my options. Then I can make the mental map to how that actually relates to what I work with. And then I'm off to the races.
So I'm curious, Pam, are you familiar with Darwin Core? Have you ever used that much?
No, I'm not.
Let me show you. I'm just going to share a link in the chat for their quick reference guide, which to me is a very friendly format, sort of like you're describing. And I just want to see if it's in the ballpark of what you're thinking about.
Cool. It probably is. I'm speaking from a place of ignorance here.
Oh, no, it's good, but also don't Darwin Core also has confusing pages too, so it's not like they hit it out of the park every time. But some of the reasons it's confusing is because sometimes you need the standard to look a certain way for certain uses,
Yeah.
as opposed to how a lot of times we approach it at first. But this is something I've been thinking about that Mixus could definitely use is a little more friendly look to it.
Oh yeah, here you've got a list on the right hand side of the things I need to think about, and then you've got definitions of each one with examples. Yeah, this is what I would want.
Okay, cool. That's helpful.
Yeah, it's a man page.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And going back to this idea about, synthesizing requirements and things like that, that's a tougher one because not every system will use the same profile of requirements. I mean, GBIF and OBIS are good examples that they have varying requirements of the Darwin Core standard. And even actually GBIF uses an EML profile that doesn't match the up-to-date EML schema. So it's a little bit of a custom thing. So it's tough because then whoever creates that tool has to constantly update it. But I think
Yeah.
actually I'm gonna punt it over to Sarah O'Connor, who has definitely seen requirements come and go in her work. So like Sarah, do you think something like that is worth pursuing?
Short answer is I don't know. I mean, I think there's definite benefits to it, but I don't know who was talking earlier today where we say we use metadata standards, but every catalog develops their own custom profile of the standard to meet their own search needs.
Yeah.
Mhm. I wonder if to synthesize these 3 pages together in some way, we could sort of talk about the things that are the same. Like I'm sure they have title, I'm sure they have spatial information, temporal information, and then maybe talk about how they branch off from each other. Like obviously Mixus, I don't actually know anything about Mixus, but I guess it's talking about genetics things, and EML is more ecological focused. So maybe that could help people who are looking at these pages know where they might want to go. And I don't know if there's other metadata options in biology that might be helpful as well. I honestly don't know.
Well, in the context of this document, I think what you just described could fit well under like a parent page for these sections. So, we had introduced this as this is the section called provide context and understandability to your data. So we can, put that how's that type of description there and then have people pursue standards.
I think that'd be good.
I don't know where to put that. Do you mind making sure we don't forget that part, Laura?
I'll write that down. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, y'all, that's we have just 10 minutes left, so I'd like to wrap it up. But and then I see, what Pam, what you put in the chat there, the CEO's analysis ready data. I don't know. I know that sort of data quality is a constant discussion in biology because it's hard to find clear standards. Like satellite data are a little bit lucky in that, at least in my naive opinion, the data are consistent enough that that it is able to say this is sort of level 1 processing, level 2, level 3. You know, I know NASA has those standards. And every time I've tried to cross that bridge with some, biological data, it seems like you quickly get into the weeds of trying to say like, well, it's processed to a certain level of readiness, but for this use, but not for that use. And then, you start sort of splitting hairs. Anyway, that doesn't mean we can't do that. And I had never heard of this before, so I'm looking forward to looking into it. But I think biology, it's a crutch sometimes that we lean on. We say, oh yeah, no, we're different, we're special, we're a mess. But I think also sometimes we're a mess, and we use that as an excuse to not learn things. So. Okay. So yeah, we just have a few minutes left. I guess let's go back to trying to capture 3 takeaways and shared insights from our work today. Because if we can get this written down now, then nobody has to do it later. So that's why we're going to think about that. I guess I'll shut up for a little bit and see if anybody we can suggest more than 3. So don't be afraid to keep going if you have key thoughts from today's discussion.
I was going to add my note as one of our key takeaways about an introduction that summarizes metadata with some of the concepts that are usually captured. Maybe that could be a takeaway.
I think it'd be important to include like who should be using it as well. Wasn't sure if that would be included in what you were gonna write up, Laura, but
Yeah.
adding a who to all of the sections, I think is quite key.
Mm-hmm.
Pam, I have a question for you because you brought up some great points today. As somebody who had, was newly meeting this document, if you came upon it and you had similar questions, would you feel comfortable submitting those questions through, GitHub issues as a place to discuss them?
To be frank, GitHub is not an environment I've ever worked in. When I did my doctoral research, it was just kind of, we had our own curated data sets within our own lab. I did a massive metadata assimilation, but I didn't really work outside the broader community. So I'm exactly the kind of person who needs to be the audience for this sort of thing. And I would need to be, I think, nudged into, well, it would be interesting to figure out how to in that space. I would just need incentive to do it. If a collaborator were doing it, that would help, certainly, if I was working with someone who pulled me in.
Okay.
Just speaking as where my head was at when I was in grad school.
Sure. So I guess what I was getting at is like what sort of this meeting was great because it was a formal place to discuss and ask questions. But like if you came upon this and you didn't know about this meeting or it wasn't going to happen for a while, what would a good environment look like where you'd feel comfortable asking these questions, where people from this cluster could respond or document answers?
Oh, I see. How to make it welcoming for newcomers.
Yeah.
I think, a landing page that gives me clear information on what I can use and how I can use it, and then lets me know who are the people in this community, and it says like, ask me in big letters. Because yeah, it can definitely be intimidating when it's people that you don't know. That's true.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Fritz, go ahead.
Yeah, to Matt's point in the chat, I wasn't sure if it would be too in the weeds, but and this also related to the primer guide, but a visual example of what biological data looks like in these metadata standards, whether that's MixS or ISO XML, or an immediate link out to a visual example of what that data looks like in the standard itself.
That's a really good point, Fritz, that it wouldn't be that hard because it's a small group, and it wouldn't be that hard to maintain like a link out or try to embed something like a visualization in it. Because if it broke, we could quickly repair it or find a replacement. But as opposed to like trying to maintain some example ourselves, that might be complicated. But yeah, I see the point of what you're saying, and it also goes hand in hand. Okay.
to kind of close the loop to actually see the metadata, the biological metadata specifically sitting within that metadata file or standard. And I had the same thought for the like longitude and latitude on the primer guide, as well as a PID. It may be nice to see a visual example of what a PID looks like in a metadata record itself. Maybe too in the weeds though.
No, I mean, this is where we're trying to live, is right on the edge of the weeds. You know, we're like this ecotone of mode and weeds, and like, you know, manicured and weeds. And we're trying to live there on purpose because we want to have enough detail that people are like, oh, cool, I learned something, but not so much detail that they say I can't handle this. So it's not too much.
Yeah. And in the mix of all this feedback and constructive feedback, I just want to give my thanks to all y'all for bringing us into this process. And the primer guide does look good. I learned a lot from it, so appreciate that.
So cool, I'm glad to hear that. Okay, so we have 4 takeaways that we've come up with. We've come up with synthesizing these 3 pages with an introduction of some kind. That we should include information about who would use these different standards. I had added, you know, are there friendly ways for people to engage with questions and feedback? Or I'll say friendly / obvious, maybe. To Pam's questions in the chat. And then showing visual examples. I guess is a good summary, basically showing visual examples as much as possible. Is that a good way of stating it? Okay, cool. Well, we just have 2 minutes left. Oh, go ahead.
No, I think so. Personally, I think it'd be good to be, yeah, as illustrative as possible. I think we'll make that comment in the chat. Sorry. Kelsey. I think it'd be great if the examples are illustrative rather than theoretical. I fully agree with that.
Okay.
And then Matt, to the, I guess to the EML record that you kind of linked as an example, I'm a little torn on that because I think it's a great example, but at the same time, the way that it's formatted is what's the right word here? A little daunting. I can imagine it being daunting for users. So I'm not sure whether or not that's the right approach, but then again, I'm not really clear on how that could be made more user-friendly, I guess. Do you have any thoughts on that? Would an example like that be useful to you, I guess?
For me, it would be, but I'm one of those crazy people who likes it when I go into a session and people are sharing their code and they're writing Python in teeny tiny font and nobody can read it. And I'm like, oh, go, go, go. So I'm definitely the odd one out here. I guess I was just thinking of like providing some context of like, okay, here's all of the information that you just explained to me. What does that look like? Like right now, I've been searching for the last 15-20 minutes for a Mixus example of like, what is this JSON LD structure? Where does my stuff actually go? Because that's what's interesting to me, is how am I going to write the code to make the metadata file? That's probably not the audience we're going after here. But onto, I think, Pam's comment of like, where's the point at which it's worth me investing my time to learn this? I think that's where it'd be helpful to show like landing pages and like the metadata that you're collecting is populating this landing page that people are using to find your data, and like having those types of examples. Maybe, I don't know if having the link directly to the XML is all that beneficial, but like having that visual of like, here's a landing page and here's how that information gets sucked up and used in other places.
Like that.
All right, I'm gonna rein us back in here. No teeny tiny font for you, Matt, just solid summary information. So, okay, so how to engage in the future. If like I said, we have our next meeting on February 1st. You can find the meeting information on our Wikipedia, which is linked here. And if you just Google, ESIP Biological Data Standards Cluster, you should be able to find it pretty quickly. We also have a Slack channel where we do a fair amount of discussion within ESIP, within the ESIP Slack. It's a great place to also just share resources, events, that kind of thing. On the wiki, you can also find our email list, which is another place to contact everybody in the cluster. I think we actually have a couple hundred people on that list, but there's just, maybe a few dozen that come to the meetings regularly. And then finally, we do have a GitHub. One last thing I do want to say about all these things that, like, for example, Tim, you were bringing up, like, should we do this? Should we do that? We have the luxury of being able to try things out. So let's try it out. And if people hate it, if it works or not, then we can learn by sort of, what's the word? Empirical work. Sorry, my kids just got home. They're all like, they're looking at me. They're waiting to jump on me. All right. Well, listen, thank you to everybody for coming today. This was really a really constructive session, and we really appreciate it. Thank you to ESIP and Megan Orlando for helping us organize things. Also, Yin for helping us today, as well as Patty. And then, of course, my co-chairs, Laura and Tim. And then Kyla, our former fellow, and also general help. And yeah, just thanks a lot. This is always a pleasure coming to this group.